Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Bryce is Right. And I guess I should be welcoming myself back because I've been gone for a couple weeks. So went on a little bit of a vacation there and was supposed to do a show last week, but we ran into a little snafu. I had a blackout and lost all internet. So we had to postpone last week's show to this week. Apologize about that for those of you who are looking forward to tonight's show. But the good news is I get to bring it to you tonight. So no snafus, hopefully. Knocking on wood. Snafu is military jargon, by the way, for situation normal, all effed up. Some of you may not have known that, but I assume everyone by now knows what snafu is as it's made its way into pop culture. But getting on with it, tonight we have a good episode. It's kind of a common ground episode. I do these every now and again. It is with a Christian apologist who's also an author. He has delivered lectures and seminars to churches and educational institutions on apologetics, textual criticism, creation science, ethics, critical thinking, the philosophy of science, understanding New Age thought, and the defense of Christian theism. That's a lot. His name is Phil Bair, and he is an outspoken opponent of Marxism, as well as other progressive ideas such as critical race theory and reparations. And it might be interesting to talk about that stuff with him in the future. A little bit more background: as a lecturer, he covers current religious, philosophical, cultural, and political trends with an emphasis on formulating a meaningful and coherent Christian response in those areas. So, ladies and gentlemen, Phil Bair, come on down. You are the next guest on The Bryce is Right. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you having it. We appreciate you coming, and also for indulging, me playing around with the schedule a little bit. I apologize for last week's snafu. We talked a little bit beforehand, and it was really gracious of you to accommodate your schedule so that we could put this off to actually talk, because I think it's going to be a good conversation, and I think people would be interested in hearing what you have to say.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate it too. And I was bummed last week, and but I just wanted to make sure you were okay, and that whenever there's a power outage, sometimes you worry about whether people are in danger and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
I was just concerned about you mainly.
this one was fairly benign. It wasn't the situation where I was out of food, water, and everything. And also it was still daylight here at the time, so it wasn't a big deal. It lasted for about an hour and a half, but
Okay.
it's when you have one before you're going to do a show, a little awkward. Huge monkey wrench. So not third world, first world problems, right? First world problems, not a big deal. Nobody died, nobody got hurt.
Right.
I can't really complain too much, especially because you're here talking to me right
now. Yeah. I've often commented when I'm notorious for complaining about my internet service, and for complaining about incompetent software developers when I'm trying to run an app and it's breaking down and everything. And sometimes I lose my perspective, and I just think to myself, boy, the people in third world countries just don't understand suffering the way I do,
Right.
And I mean, it's kind of pathetic, when you think about it, so I try to maintain a sense of perspective when stuff like this happens, because, it's us and our first world problems, boo hoo.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there are inconveniences that everybody has, but that's a great way of looking at it, putting it into perspective. I'm a humanist, and so I constantly try to remind myself of the situations going on around the world, not just around the world, but even in our own country with people who are less fortunate. So, I can complain, but I choose not to. People ask me how I'm doing. I'm better than most, although not as good as some. So,
well, you're an inspiration to me when you make a commitment not to complain, because sometimes I slip, and
sometimes I slip too. Yeah. We don't always make it. That's the thing about commitments. It's something that you're striving to attain. It's the goal. It doesn't mean you're going to be perfect and always live up to it, but as long as you have that as goal, you have to at least set a goal for yourself, even if you don't meet it. It's when we don't set a goal that we make no effort in meeting it,
Right.
All right, enough about that. Let's get on to you. Phil Bair, who are you? What do you do? I gave my introduction, and my introduction is usually something of a canned introduction from cannibalized from some other source, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's at the mercy of whoever wrote it and how up to date it is. But I'm sure people would more often like to hear from the horse's mouth. You're not a horse. I'm just using an expression there, but people
Sometimes I
want to
can be
hear
a
from
horse's ass.
people want to hear from the person who they are in their own words. So, how would you describe who you are and what you do for a living and how you got into that?
Well, I mean, as a Christian, I would say the primary thing that defines me is my relationship with Christ. And one of my favorite authors was Brennan Manning, and he wrote a book called, I think it was called Abba's Child. And his thesis in that book was that the main thing that defines you is how God feels about you. So that's really my primary central identity as far as I'm concerned. But I just a little bit of background. I grew up in a Christian home. My father was a Methodist minister. He was killed in a car train accident when I was 9 years old.
Mm.
And I have Methodist ministers in my family as well. So I grew up in the Methodist church and a Christian home. And but in my high school years, I met a guy who was the son of one of the Methodist ministers who replaced my father at the church. And this guy was just hardcore into philosophy. And he
Hmm.
got me hooked on philosophy. I became fascinated with philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and ontology, and all these things, logic, logical thinking, formal logic, and that kind of thing. And
Hmm.
so I couldn't wait to graduate from high school and go to a university and major in philosophy. So I went to the University of Iowa and majored in philosophy there and studied Greek philosophy and logical, analysis, formal logic and so on. But as you probably can guess, the majority of my professors at the University of Iowa were extremely hostile to Christians and Christianity, and I think that some of them actually thought that they were doing us a favor, by challenging our Christian beliefs. And it turns out that, as far as I'm concerned, they were doing me a favor. But at the time, they completely dismantled my faith in Christ. And I would go home on the weekends and talk to my mom about it. And she was just beside herself. She was panicking because she was thinking, oh, my son is losing his faith and I don't know what to do about it. So she talked to her friends, and one of her friends said, if he's interested in philosophy and you're concerned about him losing his Christian faith, why don't you get him a book by a Christian philosopher? And so not long after that, I got a book in the mail from my mom, and it was a book by a guy named Francis Schaeffer. And the name of the book was How Should We Then Live? And that book just literally changed my life, uh, because it's not that everything he said was necessarily valid, but what he basically was saying is the Christian faith should be open to challenges and it should be open to skepticism. And it's
Hmm.
okay to question your faith. It's okay to ask questions and to have doubts. Because if you have doubts and you work through them, then your faith is going to be stronger as a result. So I began to devour all the rest of his books. He wrote a book called Escape from Reason, which I think is a monumental work.
Hmm.
He wrote a book called The God Who Is There, and then also He Is There and He Is Not Silent, and that book is about the Christian revelation claim. And so he backed up all of these arguments, with a lot of analytical data and analytical, support, and just the fact that Christianity could be subjected to philosophical analysis and philosophical challenges is really what made the difference for me. And I began to read C.S. Lewis and all sorts
Made
of.
the difference in terms of you accepting philosophy as a path or accepting Christianity.
It made a difference in in the sense that there isn't a conflict between philosophy and Christianity. That Christianity is a philosophical system in a sense, but it's
Mhm.
more than that. But even though it's more than a philosophical system, it's not less than a philosophical system. And it can be discussed rationally and philosophically. And that's what I never understood before. Because when I was growing up, I just thought that Christianity was something that you just believed because your parents believed it, and that you believed it by blind faith, and you didn't ask questions. Um,
Mhm.
Now, I didn't grow up in a real legalistic home. I didn't grow up in an environment where asking questions of your faith was frowned upon, and I was never punished for asking questions, but I never understood that Christianity is not something that you should just simply accept on blind faith. And once I started reading these Christian apologists, and especially Francis Schaeffer, all that changed for me. And I went through lots of cycles of doubt and skepticism and attempting to understand things on a deeper level and so on. Um, so I eventually got married, had a couple kids, and moved to Colorado. Um, and by trade, I'm a software developer, but I'm also a photographer and I'm also a musician. So I'm kind of like, that's kind of like my,
Multifaceted.
yeah, it's kind of like my three. I've been accused of being a Renaissance man. I don't know if I live up to that title or not, but
Well,
um,
here's the test. Are you good at any of them? Because a lot
um,
of people can play a tune every now and again, a lot of people can, I can't remember the other two things you said.
take a picture, take a video, take a
Yeah,
picture. Yeah, photography,
a lot of people take pictures, a lot of
right?
people play around on their instruments at home. A lot of people do a lot of different things and they call themselves Renaissance people, but you
Well,
know,
like I said, I've been accused of being a Renaissance man, but I've never claimed to be a Renaissance man.
yeah.
Um,
And I
so,
think that if you're good at all of them, or you make a living doing all three of them, then I think it's a fair description.
mhm.
I think we call I think people have all kinds of names for that, but if you can make a living doing them and you enjoy doing them, that's the important thing for me.
Well,
People can say
I've
anything they want, but
yeah.
you just have to point out your talent areas where they lack.
Right. Well, I've made a living doing all three, at one
There you
point
go.
or another. And there
Yeah.
were times when those vocations actually overlapped. So for years, I've been a worship leader in a church, in various churches, and
Mhm.
I've used my musical talents there, and I've led bands and so on. But I'm also a recording artist, so I have instrumental recordings and a few vocal recordings, and you can get them on SoundCloud and so on. So I'll send you the link and I'll let you listen to the music and you can tell me whether you
I can
think I'm
judge
any
for
good at
myself.
it.
Fair enough.
But
Fair
but
enough.
I've been playing guitar since I was 11 years old. So hopefully I've gained a little bit of skill.
And I'm
Um,
guessing by now you must be at least 15.
oh, yeah, yeah. Well,
Okay.
actually I'm 16, but yeah.
Hey, you've had
Uh,
a couple years.
nope, I'm 96 and going on 97. So yeah. Um,
In dog years, right?
and right.
Okay.
Uh,
So you've talked a little bit about this. You mentioned the fact that you grew up in a Christian household. You went through periods of skepticism. You studied philosophy. It brought you back to faith. And you did dig a little into that. But I'm curious about the positions you hold now, where you settle on belief. How did you come to that? Was there any point in your life where you didn't believe what you do right now?
Well, in certain aspects of my Christian faith, there have been times in my life where I haven't believed what I believe now.
Okay.
Um,
When
there
was
was a
that?
time, pardon me.
When was that? Like at what stage of life?
Oh, college years and then post college years. But there have been times in my life when I have changed my mind on certain positions, certain theological matters. I've changed my mind on them because I've had discussions with other people who challenged my positions and actually gave me enough of an argument that I
Yeah.
had to
Do you have an
change my mind
example?
on them.
which kind of position that you used to hold that you now hold to a different belief?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
I was just looking for like an example of something that you used to believe that you no longer believe, or something
Oh,
that you didn't believe that you now believe.
um, I I used to believe that that marriage was absolutely insoluble.
In
So
what way?
well, I thought that if you got a divorce, that was a mortal sin in the eyes of God. And I'm
Hmm.
borrowing kind of a Catholic term when I say mortal sin,
Yeah, I
but
was going to say you were a Methodist, right?
right.
Okay,
But
so
but sometimes Methodists use some of the terminology that was a little bit common to the Catholic Church, although they had a little bit of a different spin on it
I'll
once in a
give you a
while.
little bit of a perspective from a former Christian turned atheist.
Uh-huh.
All of the Christian denominations use language stolen from the Catholic Church, like Trinity, So there's a
Yeah,
lot of different things since they
yeah.
all ultimately came from the Catholic Church.
There's a
But
lot of
yes, that is a specific Catholic, I'll go to far as to say dogma, not
right.
derogatorily, but it is specific to Catholicism. I don't, and all forms of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism,
Yeah.
Episcopalian,
And
Anglican,
it's and
etc.
it's common in a lot of Protestant circles as well.
I
Um,
was not aware of that.
yeah, so there are some Protestant circles that I consider kind of on the legalistic side,
Hmm.
and I try to avoid legalism. And I think that there are some senses in which it can be a product of legalistic theology.
Now, what do you
Um,
mean by that? Because you've used the term a couple of times now, and I'm not really sure how you're using it. When you say legalistic, you're not talking about U.S. code, or criminal law.
no,
What are we talking about when we say legalistic in the
well,
religious sense?
there's two aspects of it that I think of when I think of the term legalism.
Hmm.
One of them is the idea that in order to please God, you have to obey the law of God, and the law that's
Gotcha.
written down in the Bible. Um, and
So you're talking about biblical law, like the Old Testament law. It sounds
the
like specifically.
biblical Old Testament law, but also some of the biblical morality that's expressed in the Bible. Now the Bible is not the origin of morality, but it does reflect moral principles and it does articulate moral principles. And so, if you're a legalist, then you tend to believe that in order to please God, you have to obey all of those moral principles that you find in the Bible. And that if you do, then God will accept you and you will have merit in God's eyes based on the fact that you're following these moral principles. And if you don't follow these moral principles, then you don't have merit in the eyes of God. God doesn't like you anymore, and God's going to punish you. And and so you can't have a relationship with God unless you follow all these moral principles to the letter. Um, and so that's one aspect of what I consider legalism. The other aspect of it is the idea that we are actually saved in a soteriological sense by works instead of being saved by grace and receiving it through faith. And I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of theology,
Yeah,
So
so it sounds like you used to adopt more of the Catholic dogmatic positions when it comes to theology. I'll just say the distinction between different type of sins, the path to salvation, and even though you grew up as a Methodist, you kind of adhered more towards Catholic theology. And it sounds like you're saying that you've had your mind changed because you talked to a specific Christian, I'm guessing, who came from the
yeah,
Protestant backgrounds who disagreed with all of that.
yeah. So and it's true that a lot of these things did originate with the Catholic Church, but it's also true that some of them are shared in common by other denominations, and so
Methodists
it's
believe in mortal sins.
not necessarily Methodist, but I had a lot of friends who went to different churches, Nazarene churches, Lutheran churches, Baptist churches. In fact, I even went to a Baptist church for a while, a long, long time ago.
Right.
Um,
I don't think
and
they believe in that either, but
no, well,
you had one presumably.
you'd be surprised. There are actually factions within some of these denominations that are more legalistic and have that view of the insolubility of marriage.
Mhm.
And it may be borrowed from the Catholic Church, or it may simply be consistent with the Catholic Church. But whatever it is, I think that the absolute insolubility of marriage is a mistaken theological concept.
Okay.
I don't know if we want to go into that in detail.
Maybe a little bit later we might circle
Yeah,
about to that, but
yeah.
I do have some more questions because first time guest on the show, and I'm sure the audience would like to get to know you.
Sure.
If we get enough that like you, we'll probably consider having you back or ask to see if you want to come back if you enjoyed the experience. But for that, we want to know who Phil Bair is, and you gave us a pretty good rundown. And one of the things you mentioned was philosophy and science, and all of these other things that you became interested in during your formative years, or your college years rather. I'm curious, when it comes to science and philosophy, particularly argumentation and critical thinking, those areas of philosophy, a lot of people might argue that this is in conflict, that these things are conflicting, and it's difficult to reconcile a lot of that, like with science, for example. So how difficult has that been for you when you were talking about your professors being hostile to you? Were they hostile because they viewed conflicts between what they were teaching and what you believed?
No, they were hostile because they thought that what I believed had no evidence to support it whatsoever. They thought that it was a primitive superstition type of belief system, and they thought it was unscientific, because they gauged the merits of any belief system on how scientific it was and how well it can be supported by scientific theories.
And
So
these were your philosophy your
yeah,
philosophy professors?
yeah, because a lot of
Okay.
them were naturalists. They didn't believe in the supernatural, and so they would pretty much criticize anybody who did believe in the reality of the supernatural world.
Were there more
Um,
than one? Because you keep saying they. So I don't know if you had, like, did you have multiple philosophy professors?
every philosophy professor I had was hostile to Christianity.
Were they all from the same institution?
I don't actually know. I don't even know where they got their graduate
No, no,
degrees.
no. Were they all teaching in the same institute?
Oh yeah,
Did
yeah,
you
yeah. They
did you
were all
have all of them in the same institution that you went to?
right. It was all at the University of Iowa. Yeah,
Okay. It's possible it could have been a University of Iowa thing,
I don't know,
because
but
I
it's
went to I didn't have that experience when
really.
I went through. There were I had certain professors, and like my geology professor, which is one of the natural sciences. We never spoke about Christianity, but when you take geology, and this is universal, the first question they ask is, do we have any really religious people in here? Because
Hmm.
they're going to teach stuff that, depending on your background, is going to conflict with what your religion teaches.
Right.
So I wouldn't even really call that hostile. But I majored in psychology, which requires philosophy courses, and I
Hmm.
didn't have that experience, but I went to a different institution. So I don't know, I guess maybe I'm a little bit defensive, or coming to the defense of some in the field. I don't think necessarily all of them would be like that. I think
Well, I don't think all of them are, but the other aspect of this is that I don't resent the fact. I mean, even if the majority of college professors were secularists and were hostile to Christianity, I don't consider that a bad thing,
Mhm.
because. Like I said before, I kind of alluded to this a little bit before. I actually think that my college professor did me a favor by challenging my Christian faith. And when I picked the pieces up after having all my dominoes knocked down, I used to tell people, I said, it's better to have all your dominoes knocked down than to have them standing up for the wrong reasons. So,
So when you have a strong Christian faith, I can tell. I'm curious, what kind of a Christian would you say you are? And I don't mean Methodist or Baptist. Yeah, I think are you still Methodist, by the way?
no,
Okay. What denomination would you classify yourself?
I'm not affiliated with any particular denomination,
Okay.
actually. Yeah.
Would you consider yourself a young earth creationist?
Well, that depends on on what context you're talking about it with, because you asked me this question before when we were offline, and part of my answer is that theologically, I am a creationist, and as far as the age of the earth is concerned, I am rather agnostic in terms of as far as uh, I'm agnostic about the age of the earth.
Okay.
I respect people who think that the earth is young, and I respect people who think the earth is infinite, or not infinitely, but I mean, extremely old. Billions of years old. I respect both of those positions, and I think both of those positions have merit. And there are lots of good arguments on both sides of that issue.
What?
Um,
So you don't lean one way or the other? Like, yeah, I know you
um,
said you're agnostic, which means you're not committed and it's unknown to you. But do you lean more towards one belief or the
I
other? Do you think one is more likely than the other?
well, this is also a complicated answer. I lean toward a creation week that occurred in space-time history, but that doesn't necessarily correlate to a young Earth, because it could be that if you want to lay out the creation story and you want to say that God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning, Genesis 1:1. Um, and then it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the surface of the waters, and so on. God said, "Let there be light." And then we begin a narrative of a creation week,
Hmm.
that talks about certain things being created or formed on certain days, and that the transition between those days are described as an evening and a morning. And so when I see that kind of language, that tells me that we're talking about a normal Earth day night cycle. Now, whether or not how long that cycle was, I don't know, and I don't think we need to know. But I usually am skeptical of the interpretations that say that the days of creation were long periods of time. I don't think that that's supported by the text. And I think usually that is a matter of superimposing an antecedent scientific bias onto the text. So um, there could have been a creation week that occurred in space and time, and it could have involved Earth days where there was evening and morning the way that we experience them now. But that creation week, if it did occur that way, it could have come about, and it could have occurred billions of years after the Earth was actually created. So I tend to kind of granularize these things and split them up and try to not lump them all together into one coherent narrative. I think it's more complicated than that.
It
Um,
sounds like you lean towards old Earth creationism, but you still attempt to maintain a literalist interpretation of the creation story. And so that's what it sounded like to me.
yeah,
Like
it's
you believe, or you're inclined to believe the scientific evidence that suggests that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, but simultaneously you interpret the creation story as literal 6 creation days.
yeah, and I don't necessarily believe that the Earth is that old. I simply affirm
Sure.
the
You said you were
possibility.
agnostic on it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I affirm the possibility that it's that old. Um, so but the main point that I make about Genesis is that if you want to understand what the book of Genesis is trying to say, you have to meet the book on its own terms, on its own literary genre. And you have to avoid trying to superimpose an antecedent ideology on top of the text and force the text to say something that it doesn't necessarily say originally, just because you want it to fit into your preconceived scientific theories.
I
Um,
actually agree with everything that you just said, although I would remove the word scientific because I think that that statement applies to any theory. I think that you have to look at what it says and interpret it from the framework, that the best framework that we can imagine the authors meant, and not
right.
superimposing your own beliefs onto it. Where we would probably disagree is this is something I think almost every Christian does. And I probably I haven't heard your exegesis of Genesis or any other parts of the Bible, but my suspicion is, listening to your argument, that it's something that you do as well. I took the word science out of it. You're not imposing a scientific uh, viewpoint on it, but I think that you may be imposing your interpretation onto the text when you interpret it in a certain way.
Well, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to approach the text from a position of neutrality and listen to what the text has to say to me instead of try to tell the text what it says.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Do you
latter
think other
is
people are not doing that?
no, I think other people are doing it. I
Okay.
think a lot of people attempt to do that as much as possible, but I think there's also a lot of people who are taking an antecedent ideology and an antecedent bias and then superimposing that on the text. And I think that's a mistake that we need to avoid.
And you're saying you don't do that?
I'm saying that I'm committed to trying not to do that. I'm trying to
Okay.
avoid that at all costs.
Sure.
So one of the examples of this, a very, very common example of this, is to interpret Genesis based on, and the reason I use a scientific theory is because we're talking about the book of Genesis right now. We may want to talk about different ideologies that may come to bear on other parts of the Bible, and those ideologies might be affected by the text. They might affect the text in different ways depending on what the genre is that you're looking at. But usually, what people superimpose on top of Genesis is a scientific bias. And that's why I use the term scientific, because I think that's a common mistake, and I'm trying to avoid the mistake of superimposing my antecedent bias onto the text as much as I possibly can.
When you say scientific bias, do you mean a bias that occurs when someone learns science, or do you mean something else?
I mean a bias that comes from the acceptance of certain scientific theories,
Okay.
um, and and then in addition to that, I'm also talking about a scientific bias where there is a philosophical framework that is built around the scientific theories that someone has accepted or holds. And the most common philosophical bias that surrounds the scientific endeavor is the bias of naturalism. Um, and so sometimes when I say that, we could interpret it as saying holding a naturalistic science or naturalistic scientific bias.
Hmm.
And sometimes someone may not have a naturalistic scientific bias. And if
You're
that's
not
the
a
case,
naturalist.
no, I'm not a naturalist. No.
You believe in the supernatural.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Is it possible that you have a supernatural bias?
Supernaturalism bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think possibly. Yeah, that's
Okay.
possible. But what we have to look at is whether or not the text has a supernatural framework to it. Because
I mean,
when
obviously it does.
Yeah,
That would be,
so if that's the case, then it's okay for me to have a supernatural bias if the text actually prescribes a supernatural bias.
unless you're
Um,
trying to determine whether the text is true, and then it's not.
Pardon me?
Unless you're trying to determine whether or not the text is true, and then you can't use that bias,
Right,
because that's one of the claims of the text, right? That
right,
would be circular.
right.
Okay.
Sure. Yep.
Would you consider yourself a biblical literalist?
Um, that also is a complicated question with a complicated
Okay.
answer.
I love
Um,
complicated answers. That's why I ask
I,
complicated
I,
questions.
I don't always take the Bible literally because the Bible isn't always literal. I
Hmm.
take the Bible literarily, which
What does that
means that
mean?
whenever I read the Bible, what I attempt to do is identify the literary genre of the passage of the Bible that I'm reading at any given moment.
Okay.
And so there's lots of literary genres in the Bible. There's poetry, there's history, there's apocalyptic literature, and there's prose. And so if you're reading a passage in the Bible or a book of the Bible, the first thing you want to do is identify what the literary genre of that book is. So if the literary genre of the book of Song of Solomon is poetry.
Hmm.
And so I'm not going to take the Song of Solomon literally because it's silly to take poetry literally.
What is the literary genre of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3?
It is a historical, space-time historical narrative
Okay.
that is written in a form that has meter and rhyme. So this is the interesting thing about Genesis. It's a very interesting genre, and some people look at the literary genre of Genesis and they see, well, gosh, that's got all sorts of symmetry to it, and it has all this meter. And whenever we see symmetry and meter in a in a literary work, what we usually think of that as, well, we're reading poetry because it has meter and symmetry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a mistake, because what you have to understand is that when Genesis was written, there weren't a whole lot of books available, and you couldn't just go down to the local bookstore and buy a copy of the Bible and buy a copy of the book of Genesis.
When you say written, you're talking about when it was first like physically written, or what are we talking about when we say written? Are we talking about when the scribes were recalling what was passed down through oral tradition and the original languages?
Well, that depends on what theory you subscribe to in terms of oral tradition.
Okay.
But
what do you mean by written, I guess, is the short way?
Well, written down, written with a stylus and a papyrus or whatever it is.
Okay. First put pen to paper then.
Yeah,
literally
when they put pen to paper.
Gotcha.
So if you live in a culture where we're writing and reading words on the page is rare, then you have to write your content in such a way that people can easily learn it and memorize it. So the book of Genesis is written in such a way that it's got symmetry, it's got some even divisions, and it has a structure to it that lends itself to memorization very easily. And what people do, in my opinion, is they look at that genre and they see how structured it is, and they see how much meter there is and how much symmetry there is, and they mistake it for poetry. They say, well, we shouldn't interpret this literally, because this is not meant to be interpreted literally, because look at all the symmetry and look at all the meter in it.
Would you say that no, I get it. Yeah. I'm curious. Would you say that every book of the Old Testament is written with the same symmetry to where it could be mistaken as poetry?
No, not necessarily, because the Old Testament was written over a wide span of centuries.
What is the oldest book of the Old Testament?
I'm not sure I know that answer to that question.
Most people,
you may know.
Most scholars, and it's somewhat unknown because no one can be absolutely sure. We don't have any of the original copies, but based on most of the scholars that I've seen answer this question, Job is usually considered to be the oldest book.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, and so I was wondering if you view Job the same way as you view Genesis.
I don't think the genre of Job is the same is exactly the same as that of Genesis. But there's two things that we need to note about the book of Genesis. The first thing is that there has been a widespread theory that a great percentage of people, both inside and outside the church, have accepted for a long time. And that theory is called the documentary hypothesis. And if you're familiar with the documentary hypothesis, it was put forward by a guy named Julius Wellhausen. And it was sometime in the 19th century, I believe. It might even have been earlier than that. And his theory was that the book of Genesis and actually the Pentateuch itself, all the Pentateuch, was handed down by oral tradition for centuries and centuries upon centuries. And then finally, it was written down much, much later in the history of ancient Israel.
For those who may not understand some of the terminology, the Pentateuch, you're referring to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and I missed one.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus.
What's the 5th one? Whatever. It's the
I'm having a brain block.
Sorry. I didn't want it to get too far away from that because you
Numbers.
used a word that.
Numbers.
There you go, numbers. Right. So sorry. So the theory that the first 5 books were passed down through oral tradition, and then you were going to carry on from there.
Yeah. So the theory was that the first 5 books were, and other books as well, were passed on through oral tradition and were actually written, put to paper, or whatever it is they were writing on, stone, tablets or whatever, that they were written down much later in the history of ancient Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that Julian Wellshausen actually proposed that hypothesis was that he saw what he considered to be late words in the text, words that didn't appear in the literary history of Israel until much later in its history. It would be like picking up an ancient manuscript that was, say, 500 years old, and it had the words computer and cell phone and tablet on it. Okay.
I don't want to make it super long because we're going to go out of time, but I do think the point that you're getting to is you don't believe that these were passed down through oral tradition over a long period of time.
Right. So just real quickly, I'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Real quickly, there was a discovery in 1978 of the Ebla Kingdom in northern Syria, and there was tons of writing that were excavated in that archaeological dig of the Ebla Kingdom. And what they discovered was that the words that were thought to be very late words were actually extremely early words. And so the basis for thinking that these were written down later because of that later terminology was actually discredited. And they discovered that Israel was perfectly capable of recording their own history much earlier than what most people previously thought. So I don't give a whole lot of stock in the idea of handed down by oral tradition for centuries upon centuries.
When do you think they
may have
were
been
written?
Pardon me?
When do you think Genesis? When do you think the first 5 books were written?
That's a good question. I would probably take the side of some of the scholars who think that it was written around 1400 BC, something like that. So,
Yeah,
but
because
there's lots of disagreement.
I'm confused about 2 things, because if you believe that they were written at about 1400 BC, the book of Genesis talks about the beginning. And if this is a historical, literal account where there's 6 days and then we're counting genealogies after that, that only brings you to 1400 plus years ago that the Earth existed. And that is clearly contradictory.
Well,
with
it
science.
brings us to 3,400 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I'm
just, and I recognize this is a naturalistic perspective because I'm asking you about science, but I'm curious how you would reconcile that.
Well, but because I'm not saying that the book of Genesis was written down right after the creation week. Okay, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that it was.
Yeah.
What I'm saying that it was written down much earlier than many scholars previously believed that it was written down, and it's because they were so heavily influenced by the documentary hypothesis.
Right, but the point of the question, the point of this whole, I think, investigation in theology is to figure out how old the Earth is. That's one of them. But how old the original cultures were that existed before they started writing, I think, is the other one.
Yeah.
But if we're saying that the culture started writing very shortly after the events happen.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay. So Genesis happened. I guess maybe the proper way to ask the question was, how much time passed between when Adam was doing things compared to when someone started recording his story?
That I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm speaking in relative terms. So what I'm saying is that Israel was capable of recording its history and recording some of these things that went into the Bible much earlier than most people previously thought. And I don't know that you can necessarily date the creation week by looking at the book of Genesis. because some of the genealogies are a little bit confusing and they're a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think that the people who first proposed this, which is James Ussher, I don't think that he used just the book of Genesis. I think he used
Right.
really the Old Testament all the way up to the Gospels.
Yeah.
Because he had to go up to Jesus.
Yeah.
I think there are problems with that. I think that that's been shown to be inaccurate in a lot of ways, but that's certainly where the young Earth creationist position of the Earth has been around for 6 to 10,000 years. That's where that came from.
Yeah, and so if you want to know my position on this, because we're getting to know me, right? If you want to know my position on this, it's possible that the creation week occurred 6 to 10,000 years ago or more,
Is
maybe a
it?
little more, but that's not necessarily when the earth was actually created. If you accept the premise that God created the heavens and the earth, by spoke them into existence out of nothing.
Now,
So the earth could have
how wouldn't it
existed.
be?
Pardon me?
Well, the creation week begins on creation day 1, right? That's the beginning of the week. And so when we look in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So
Yeah,
that would be
it doesn't say on day one God created the heavens and the earth.
no, but
It
it
says in the
concludes with
beginning.
right, but it concludes with, and then there was morning, and then there was evening, and then there was
Right.
morning, the
So
first
so
day.
how much of that text is included or meant to be included in the first day? We don't know.
I,
It could have
well,
been just
the common interpretation is that the first day is everything that precedes, and then there were morning and
right.
evening.
Yeah,
Is that
that's
not your
that.
interpretation?
It's not my interpretation, no, because
Okay,
I don't think the text necessarily dictates that to us. So the book of Genesis is kind of um, it's kind of like a movie, and when you think of watching a movie,
mhm.
and by the way, I'm going to be addressing more than one point here when I say this, so it's very important. The other point that I'm addressing here was that a lot of people think that there are multiple creation accounts in the book of Genesis, and I'm going to address uh, that point here in addition to the other things that I want to say about the first creation day. What happened
Mhm.
during the creation day and what happened prior to the first creation day, and that is that when you watch a movie, imagine watching a movie where the opening scene is a flyover of New York City, Manhattan Island, and lots of skyscrapers, and it's at night, so it looks more dramatic. And then it zooms in on a specific apartment building in on Manhattan Island, and then after that, it zooms into a specific window on that in that apartment complex or that apartment building, that apartment high rise. And then the camera zooms in and goes inside the apartment, and then you see that there are people in the apartment and they're talking to each other, and the movie
Can
begins
I make a
to
prediction
yeah.
as to where you're going? Are you trying to say that Genesis 2 is a magnification of the entirety of creation day 5?
Not necessarily day five, but what I am saying is that whenever you want to tell a story, the first thing you need to do is establish a setting and a context for that story. And then once you've established a general setting for the story, then you focus in on the main characters of the story and then bring them forward in history. And I think that's what's happening in the book of Genesis. Whether you can break it down into actual boundaries by chapters and verses and things like that, um, I'm not sure that that's necessarily possible. But you can approach it in an overall manner by saying that the creation week is the background. It's establishing the establishing shot of the movie. And I've done a lot of video, so in video, we use the term establishing shot. The establishing shot lets people know the context of the main characters, and it lets them know where they came from and who they are and so
Sure.
on. Um,
I
s-
think though what might be confusing about that is because earlier you said that you believe that the creation day was literally 6 days, just like we have here. But I'm wondering how you get to that if you have difficulty parsing where one day ends and where one
Oh, I
begins.
don't have any difficulty parsing where one day begins and one day ends and one day begins. What I'm saying is that it might not necessarily be possible to do these based on the chapter boundaries.
So
So,
how do you do it?
well,
Or do
the
you? I guess it would be the appropriate
actually
question.
there's a couple ways you could do it, and so one of the things that I learned from Francis Schaeffer is that that there are a lot of times there are a range of possibilities in these topics, and there may be multiple answers to a question, and there may be and one of those answers may be valid, but we might not always know which one.
Is it
Um,
fair to say you don't know when creation day one begins and when it ends by looking at the text?
You I don't think you can know when creation day 1 begins by looking at the first few verses of chapter 1 of
Can you
Genesis.
know everything that occurred on creation day one as far as the text is concerned?
No.
You
I think you can know I think that the latest, uh, occurrences right before "and there was evening and there was morning the first day," I think
Mhm.
whatever is closest to that phrase I think we can properly place in the first day of creation. I don't know that we have enough justification from the text itself to place God created the heavens and the earth. Um, and I don't know that we have justification to place that into day one.
Do you think that the majority of Jewish scholars would agree with the statement you just made or disagree with it?
I have no idea what the majority of Jewish scholars would say.
How
No,
about the
I don't
majority
know.
of Christian scholars?
I don't even know about that. I mean,
Okay.
there is a wide range of opinions and positions and theories,
Right.
even among Christian scholars, and
Sure.
that's okay. I mean, that doesn't threaten me. It doesn't threaten the Christian faith.
Mhm. And it's
Um,
not meant to be an argument from authority or an argument from popularity either. It
right?
was just a curiosity of mine. Your
Sure.
exegesis seems to be somewhat different,
Uh
which
huh.
is not unusual. That's
Right.
almost every Christian I talk to has a different one.
Yeah.
I the
And
reason I
and
brought up the reason I even brought up Genesis and I was curious about that is because you started off talking about Genesis and you were making the point that a lot of people interpret it as poetic, where you think that it should be interpreted historically. The
right.
reason to write it in a poetic sense was to get people to understand it. I think that's really the
Make
argument
it
you made.
make it easy to memorize. Yeah.
Sure.
Um,
But
and
I'm curious about that. In using that very logic, I'm trying to extend that onto the other passages that were mentioned, Exodus, Leviticus,
mhm.
and so on, which have kind of a different writing style.
Right,
Like you
they
wouldn't
do.
call those poetic, right?
N not necessarily, but those were legal documents, those were about civil law and that kind of thing, and about a covenant, and so on.
Yeah, they
But
were about different things, but would you still classify them in the same genre?
no, not the identical genre with Genesis. But what I'm saying is that it's very common for ancient documents from Israel to be written in such a way that they were easy to memorize. Now, the degree to which that is true is going to vary from book to book and from and from time to time. So
Hmm.
so it's not something that you can just put in a nice neat little box and tie it up with a ribbon and say, okay, that's it. We got it. The whole thing is a poetic history. I mean, we can't just make that kind of a generalization. But what we can do is we
Hmm.
can look at the genre of the book of Genesis and examine the last half of the book of Genesis and especially the last chapters of the book of Genesis, and we can identify that those chapters were meant to be understood as space-time history. There were historical figures in the last few chapters of the book of Genesis, and it is unmistakable that this is supposed to be understood as a historical account. So if you start at the end of the book of Genesis and then begin to work backwards back
Hmm.
to the beginning of the book of Genesis, you don't find any break in the actual literary genre of the book that justifies saying, all right, at this point, everything from here forward is space-time history, and everything from here back is not space-time history. It's somehow some other genre that's not meant to be understood as space-time history. There is no break in the genre of the book of Genesis. It's a unified book with a consistent genre throughout the entire work.
Okay, we got a quick question here from Jim Majors. I think this may have been answered already, but I'll let you put it into your own words. He's wanting to know what your interpretation is of evening and morning.
I think that the reason that evening and morning is there is to tell us that this is a normal Earth day.
Okay.
Because those are standard normal words and normal terms that any ancient Hebrew would understand as meaning, hey, now it's evening and now it's morning. So these
I actually agree with you that that makes it very easy to understand, but doesn't sometimes intentionally making something easy to understand mean you're sacrificing accuracy? Meaning you're translating it into such a way where it may not be actually what it is.
I think what that does is I think that it reinforces the clarity of the text.
Well, let me ask you this way. If the Earth was billions of years old and some of the creation days were thousands of years or millions of years, how would the author have been able to clearly communicate that to the audience? Would they have been able to clearly communicate that using a means other than days?
They may have, but because there are places in the Bible where long periods of time are described, in terms of history.
But in terms of the first 5 books, the people that we're keeping in the same literary genre with the same author, are there places in there?
One thing they could do is leave out the phrase evening and morning, because if they were long periods of time, then it would detract from the clarity by including the phrase evening and morning.
I agree. But if your goal is to make it clearer, then you might include that, whether it was one day or not, correct?
Possibly. But the other thing that we need to understand about the book of Genesis is that the book is not so much about when and how long ago. The book is about who created the earth, the heavens and the earth, and who is it that was the engineer behind the creation and formation of the earth and of human beings and so on. The author sometimes doesn't seem to be extremely concerned about exact times and periods of time. So sometimes you hear a phrase, in the day that so and so reigned over Israel. Well, we know that that's not a literal 24-hour period of time. We know that that's a historical period. And so the word yom in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, can mean a literal 24-hour day, and it can mean a long period of time. So you have to understand the context to see whether, which is which in order to understand what it's trying to say. And so if you look at the account of the creation week, and you see the first day, the second day, the third day, the first yom, the second yom, the third yom, someone could say, well, is that talking about a long period of time, or is that talking about a normal Earth day?
Yes.
And so I think that the author anticipated that question and said, I'm talking about a normal Earth day, so I'm going to put in, and there was evening and there was morning, so that I can make that clear to my readers.
And is that the only way they could have made it? Well, okay. I think I already asked you that, so I won't stay on that too much. So there's 6 literal days, and you mean the 24-hour version of day, right?
I'm not particular about the number of hours. I'm just saying.
Well, you said I don't know what normal means if we're not talking about 24 hours. So if by normal Earth day you mean 24 hours, then I understand you. But if you mean another normal Earth day, then I don't know what that means.
I define a normal Earth day by the rotation of the Earth, and where one side of it faces the sun, and that's day, and the other side of it faces away from the sun, and that's the night.
Okay. When was the sun created?
Whether or not that has always taken 24 hours, I don't know, and I don't care.
When was the sun created, according to the Bible?
Well, that depends on what you consider the creation of the sun. When God first said, "Let there be light," a lot of people think that was the sun, and that on the
Is that what you
fourth day,
think?
I think it was the fourth day, that he set the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. That the first let there be light could have been the creation of the sun, and then on the fourth day, God actually positioned the sun in a certain place in relationship to the Earth or the solar system or the galaxy, or however you wanted to express it.
I believe you made a point a little while ago that you have to be specific to what the text says, and you criticized adding to the text. Some might argue that you're adding words to the text that are not there
Yeah,
in order to
and
reconcile something.
so what I'm doing is I'm referring to what some scholars have postulated about the book of Genesis, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is a reasonable possibility. I'm not necessarily tied to it, but I think it's a reasonable possibility. And I was going to go on to describe another reasonable possibility, which is that when God created light, that He just created light, period, and we don't know what the source of that light was, and that on the fourth day He created the sun, and that when He created the light and created the sun, those were two separate things that He was creating.
How did
And
he separate day from night if there wasn't a sun? If he just created a source of light, then what was the mechanism by which to separate day from night?
the Earth could have been rotating, and there could have been a light source somewhere, and then the sun took over for that light source. That's a possibility.
What would be the point of even creating a sun if there was already a light source that could separate day from night?
You'll have to ask God.
Well, I'm asking, it's your theory.
Yeah.
The
No,
Bible
it's not
doesn't say
necessarily
any of
my
this,
theory.
but
I'm just describing what some people have proposed about this, and I think that they're reasonable options. And so, whether
do you-
what would the point be? I don't know.
Mhm.
What's the point of men having nipples? You know?
Well,
Um,
there isn't necessarily a point, but there's a scientific answer for that.
yeah, sure. And I'm familiar with the scientific answer.
Is there a
Uh,
biblical
so-
answer for it?
no,
Okay.
but
It seems like science wins on that one, on that question anyway.
well, I don't think there's a win or lose there, because I don't think there's any ultimate conflict between science and Christianity.
Well, that's
In
interesting
fact,
because that was actually the next question I was going to ask you, because we talked a lot about creation. I want to stick with the nipples just for a little bit longer, partially because it's humorous and I get to say nipples. But did Adam have nipples?
I don't
Do you
know.
think
I
he
have
did
no
not?
idea. My
Oh, you
guess is
don't know.
my guess is he did.
Your guess is he did.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Why? Why do you think he did?
Because God created man out of the dust of the ground. If that is a space-time description of what God did,
Mhm.
then it is a supernatural description of a supernatural act that God actually performed. And if that's the case, I see no reason why Adam didn't have nipples, just the way that normal human beings have nipples now.
Well, the
Um,
reason we have nipples now, you said you were already familiar with the scientific reason. I
yeah,
guess maybe.
yeah, but so
Mhm.
the reason that we have nipples now may not be the same reason that Adam had nipples.
Which is
The
why I'm
fact that,
curious as to why you would think he would have them then. Like, what reason would there be for him to have them at all
well, I'm,
if
I'm
he
not
was
sure.
made from dirt?
I'm not sure you're going to like this answer very much.
Well, that
But
doesn't. I
but
won't
my
like it.
general overview answer to that question is, because God is not just a creator. He's not somebody who is committed to efficiency. I think God is an artist. And
Oh,
I think that when God created the earth, when God created man and woman, I think he was creating a work of art, something that goes beyond just what we can study with scientific theories and so
so
on.
so Adam's nipples were aesthetic, if I'm hearing you
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah. I think that's a reasonable possibility. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay. Do you
But I
think that
mean, I could
that's?
be wrong. I mean, he might not have had nipples, and if he didn't, then that's fine with me.
I will take for granted that whenever you say "I think something," that you could be wrong. Otherwise, you would say "I know." You know, and you can take for granted that whenever I say "I think," I'm not expressing absolute certainty.
Okay.
But it does sound like you lean that way, that you think this is actually what is the case.
Yes.
I'm curious as to how you reconcile that with scientific evidence. We can
So,
move on from the nipples now and talk about like the creation of
well, thank you so
the
much.
earth.
I've been so wanting to move off of nipples. Do you finally grant?
Yeah, there are a lot of things in the Bible that contradict science. And you started by saying that we shouldn't put scientific bias onto our interpretation of the text to try to make it align with science.
Right.
So then you must have some other way of reconciling some of these incongruencies we see between the scientific evidence and what the Bible says actually happened.
Well, let me answer that by making a general comment and then asking you a question.
Okay.
So the general comment is, I don't see any competition between science and religion and science in the Bible. I do see a competition between naturalistic science and religion.
Is there such a thing as non-naturalistic science?
Pardon me?
Is there, when you say naturalistic science, it almost sounds like a what do you call two words that are the same? A redundancy. It sounds like a redundancy, because science without any qualifiers is the study of the natural world. So
that's one way to think of science. It's very common for science to study the naturalistic, the natural world. But
that's why we generally collectively refer to it as the natural sciences.
Okay, right.
Okay.
But I'm using a different term that is slightly different than the natural sciences. When I use the term naturalistic, I'm talking about a philosophical predisposition that scientists often approach science with, and that predisposition says that there is no such thing as a supernatural, and that there are no supernatural events that have ever occurred in history. And if you approach science based on that philosophical framework, then that's what I call naturalistic science. So
you think every scientist approaches science with that framework?
Not every scientist, no. But I think a lot of scientists that don't believe in God and don't believe in the supernatural may often approach it with that framework. And many of the atheistic scientists that I know do approach it with that framework.
Okay. But there are Christian scientists as well who don't, who also approach it from that framework.
That's true. And there are Christian scientists that don't approach it from that framework.
Okay. So we have scientists of all different kinds, but so why are you suggesting that the people interpreting it from a scientific lens are imposing a bias that only the naturalistic, because that doesn't necessarily.
What I'm saying is that sometimes when people use the term science, what they mean by it is naturalism and science being done in a naturalistic framework, which is a philosophical framework. It's a philosophical bias that people use to approach their scientific discipline.
Yes, and it's the correct one. It's the only one, really. Because if you do it from without the perspective of naturalism, I think a lot of people would say you're not doing science at that point.
Well, but that depends on their definition of science. If their definition of science is that there's no such thing as any supernatural event that has ever occurred in the history of the world, then that's a bias that they're imposing on the discipline of science that doesn't exist in science itself.
What if your position is, I don't know if the supernatural exists or not. I don't investigate the supernatural. I can only investigate the natural. Therefore, that's what I will do. What if that's your position?
Well, that's great. And that's a great, healthy position.
Okay.
Because and that's really my position. So I've studied the philosophy of science. I've studied earth sciences. I studied paleontology at the University of Colorado. And that's actually my position as a Christian and as someone who is interested in scientific studies and scientific theories. Whenever I observe any phenomenon that science may be interested in, I always assume that there's a natural explanation for whatever I'm observing. And so that's a natural approach to science, but that's different than a naturalistic approach to science.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt.
Yes. So that's okay. And so another way to put it is that that as a Christian and as someone who is interested in science and has studied science to a certain degree, I believe in the uniformity of natural causes in an open system. So what that means is that the forces of nature operate on a regular, consistent, and predictable way, and that we can study those forces of nature, we can study those patterns, and we can draw conclusions, and we can sometimes even make predictions based on the conclusions and the theories that we're drawing. And so whenever we observe anything, we automatically assume, without any other evidence to the contrary, that what we're studying is caused by the forces of nature, and that it's a natural phenomenon.
Is that an error?
No, I think that's a healthy way to approach science, and I think that's the best way to approach science. So
If you approach science in that way and you look at astronomy, for example, you arrive at the conclusion that the universe is billions of years old using that very methodology that you just described.
you arrive at the conclusion that it's possibly billions of years old.
No, this is direct observation. We can see how old it is.
Well, that's based on a certain number of assumptions, and some of those assumptions are naturalistic in nature. Did you read my book? Did you read my book, Machines Don't Laugh?
I have not.
Okay.
We haven't gotten to that yet. We do want to advertise that, but what kind of assumptions do you have?
I have a chapter. Well, so there's a difference between there are two kinds of science. One of them is what I think we can properly call operation science. And it's the science that studies the regularly repeating patterns in nature, and then comes up with conclusions and explanations for those patterns in nature and observations about those patterns in nature. There's another aspect, there's another kind of science, another flavor of science, if you will, that I think we can properly call origin science. And origin science studies the origins of natural law, the origins of the universe, the origins of the stars, and so on. And that goes back to the beginning of the universe, and it goes back to what occurred when the universe was first formed, and then when it was started to expand out from wherever.
I think that's called cosmology, isn't it?
Right, and that's cosmology.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily only cosmology, because cosmology can be about what happens now, but it can also be about what has happened in the past. And so both of those are cosmology, but you could have, to be real technical about it, the study of the origins of the universe is not really cosmology. That's called cosmogony. So and I think for us to be able to differentiate between the different kinds of science, where we have a forensic type of science that studies something that occurred in the past, and more of an operational science and observational science that studies the patterns of nature that we see in the present. I think
when you say how the universe came to be, are you talking about how it developed after the expansion or before?
Well, the universe couldn't have developed before it began, before the creation, before the whatever you want to call it, the Big Bang.
Well, that's not, none of that is in science. Like creation is not in science. That science doesn't posit creation. It only starts talking about, and like in cosmology, for example, it only starts talking about the universe at the point where it's expanding. It doesn't have anything to say about before that. So what kind of science talks about before?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that there's such a thing as a science that discusses what happened before the beginning of the universe.
Okay, yeah, I thought you were.
What I'm saying is that there's a kind of science that can study the beginning of the universe.
Right.
And
which
the nature,
that would be cosmology, would it
the
not?
nature that's cosmogony. Because whenever you have an ogeny, that's the origin of something. Like phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny.
I think that may be
included
within cosmology. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, you could do it that way. A lot of these definitions are stipulative, and I'm not necessarily picky about all of them.
But in cosmology, we got to this because I was asking about the observational evidence of the old universe, and you're saying that certain assumptions have to be made in cosmology to arrive at that conclusion. I was wondering what kind of assumptions you were saying they need to make.
Well, one of the assumptions is that the speed of light has always traveled at the same rate.
Okay.
That it has never changed in the distant past.
Mm-hmm.
But the other one is, though, that there were no
Why do you think that's an assumption?
Well, because if you're going to measure distances in the Earth or in the universe by the speed of light, and by then that assumption has to guide your decisions and your conclusions about how far away stars are and that kind of thing. Based
Well,
on
but the
how
speed
long.
of light has been tested in different locations, and it's always the same. Like it's been
Yeah,
tested very close to Earth and far away from Earth, and
yeah.
it's
Now,
right.
hmm
And so it's the same.
but we don't know that the speed of light has always been the same in the past. We weren't
Well,
around.
whenever you look into the distant universe, you're looking into the past. So if you're measuring light from that perspective, you're measuring it as it was.
That's true. What you're
This is
measuring
why
is
most
what it was
cosmologists,
in the past. But you don't know that the speed of light was traveling at the same speed in that past than it is now. That's something that we don't know.
I,
So
I mean, I think that's debate. I think a lot of physicists would say that we do know that based on some of the laws of physics.
yeah,
I mean, E equals mc squared, right? If you're increasing the speed of light, if you increase c, you're going to increase E, which
right,
changes everything.
right.
And there's no evidence. We would have a lot of evidence if the speed of light was faster in the
Well,
past. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not a physicist, so
okay.
I can't.
Well, there are two things to say about that. First of all, there are a lot of physicists who actually have created theories and have proposed theories that say that the speed of light has not always traveled at the same rate.
Do you know who
Um,
they are?
no, I can't think of the names right now, but I've been exposed to them, and I know someone who is familiar with their work.
Hmm.
And the guy that's familiar with their work is a guy named Stephen Meyer, um, and he is a Christian. He's a scientist. He has a PhD, and he's also a philosopher. And his latest book is called "The Return of the God Hypothesis." And so he's much more current on a lot of these scientific theories than I am, but I am aware that there have been some theoretical physicists who have proposed the possibility that speed of light may have changed in the distant past, and that it was not always the same speed, the same velocity.
Are there
Um,
any published articles written by
yeah,
them?
yep, there are, and I could try to find them and I could send them to you after our conversation if you want.
Yeah, that'd be cool because then we
Yeah,
could follow up. I'm a huge science guy.
yeah,
I'm a huge
yeah, and
science fiction guy.
and I
I like
love it. I love it too.
Yeah, and
But
so I'm
but the other.
always interested in space and cosmology. I had an astrophysicist on my show. I think it was the last show I did was with
Mhm.
an astrophysicist and a cosmologist. I'm not sure that he would arrive at the same conclusions that you are arriving at, but if there are other cosmologists out there who think that the speed of light has changed and that Einstein and Hawking and all these other people were just wrong, that I think that
Well,
would
they're
be.
not saying that they were necessarily wrong. A lot of these things kind of modify some of their theories a little bit, and they tweak them, and
Yeah,
and
but even
they.
doing that, that would be huge, and so that's like Nobel Prize level stuff, you know?
But the other aspect of this though is that um, when you look at the age of the universe, we normally examine the age of the universe based on certain assumptions, and those assumptions can often be that there's no such thing as a supernatural and that the beginning of the universe had no supernatural influence involved with it whatsoever.
I'm not
And
convinced that most scientists are doing that. I mean, you've said that already, but I don't know the ratio of cosmologists that begin with that assumption or not.
well, I mean, but I'm not concerned about how many of them are doing that. What I'm saying is that that is a possible way that you can approach the beginning of the universe, and that if you do approach that beginning based on naturalistic assumptions, in other words, the assumption that there's no such thing as a supernatural, then
Mhm.
you could come up with false conclusions if there is such a thing as the supernatural.
Okay, now you
And
believe in the supernatural, clearly. I think you would
Mhm.
kind of have to be in order to be a Bible believing Christian
Absolutely,
or really any other
yeah.
religion that
A,
purports a
a
God.
naturalistic Christian is a contradiction in terms.
Well, there are naturalistic Christians who
I,
exist who would
I
disagree with you
know,
on that.
I know, and they
So,
self-identify as naturalistic Christians.
right.
So yep.
So, but so that's all subjective then.
But
But
yes,
with res-
I'm a supernaturalist. I do believe in the reality of the supernatural.
Now, why do you believe in the supernatural?
Because I think that the philosophical framework called naturalism is logically incoherent, and I cannot accept it as a valid logical position to take. And the reason for that is this. The universe and natural law, which go together, by the way. And when I say natural law, I'm not talking about ideas. I'm not talking about descriptions of how the universe behaves. Right now, I'm referring to it in the sense of the natural forces themselves that we describe using terms that end up being natural law. We express as natural
I don't
law.
know what the difference. It sounded like you said the same thing
No,
twice.
no, the forces of nature and the descriptions of how nature behaves are two different things. And it's sometimes when you use the term natural law, you
Hmm.
can be referring to the forces of nature, or you can be referring to the principles and descriptions of how that nature behaves, how those forces behave. And so, natural
Okay.
law, in that sense, natural laws are not material things, they're ideas, they're
I think that
descriptions.
I would disagree with. I would say that the description of natural laws and science are called scientific theories,
Well, they may be, yeah.
because the
I
scientific
mean,
theory describes not like the theory of gravity describes the law of gravity. The law of gravity is the force that you're talking about, but the theory of
yeah.
gravity,
So in your terminology, the word law refers to the force of gravity itself.
yeah,
And
the well, there are different. It refers to that, but there are even when you say the law of gravity, when you discuss the force, you have to describe what the force is,
right,
right? So they use terminology when they say the law of
right,
gravity. They talk about large masses attracting smaller masses,
right.
or all masses or all objects with mass attracting each other
Yeah.
would be the law of
And
gravity.
those are ideas that
They don't just
describe,
say the law of gravity is gravity, and they don't,
right.
because
Yeah,
that wouldn't be useful. So it's
right.
still a description. But you're
But
talking about the
but
law
I
of gravity, and you think that
but
it's
I've heard
are
people use the word laws of nature in
laws
both
of nature,
senses.
right?
I just want to make sure that there wasn't any confusion here.
So
So
when
the
you're
for
talking the laws of nature, you think that naturalism is incoherent, and I think that's
yes.
where you left off.
Yes. So the forces of nature, I'm going to use the term forces of nature so we
Okay.
don't have any confusion. The forces of nature are not eternal.
How
They
do you
are
know?
they are contingent. And the reason we know that they're contingent because they can be acted upon by other forces. So if that's the case, then the forces of nature are are actually finite and they are contingent, and therefore they are not eternal. They haven't been around forever. And
I don't know how you can make that determination if we can't see before the Big Bang.
we can make the determination because we can understand the nature of the forces of nature.
But we can
And
only
the
understand
nature of
that
them
from the
is that they are contingent.
but we can only understand the forces of nature as they exist in our universe, right?
We can only understand the forces of nature as they exist in our universe.
Our universe from the point of the Big Bang expansion, our local
Okay.
presentation of the universe, the thing that we can observe.
Okay.
That's the only way in which we describe the forces of nature, the forces of nature that are observable to us, which
Right.
began at this
And
point, right?
the forces of nature that are observable to us right now. And
Right.
these are the forces of nature, by the way, that Stephen Hawking thinks govern all of nature and that govern all of reality. And
Um,
as far as
he
he's
actually
concerned,
all of nature in the observable universe.
right.
Right. What about the non-observable universe?
Well, first of all, let's just get through my argument for the incoherence of naturalism, and then we can address some of the exceptions and some of those other boundary conditions later.
Well,
Um,
that my objection though was with what the last thing that you just said was that we know that the laws of nature began essentially with the Big Bang. You didn't use those words, but I think that's where you were going with that, right?
yeah, the forces of nature and the space time matter and energy of the universe are
That we can
all
observe.
they're all bound up into one coherent whole. Okay, so
Yes.
okay, so if that's true, and there are numerous scientists, by the way, who are not necessarily Christians, who also affirmed the same thing, that the universe had a beginning, and that the universe and natural law and the space-time, space-time and matter and energy, all of those things as a whole, as a complete coherent thing, they all had a beginning. They are not eternal. They are contingent, they are mutable, and they are finite.
Do you
Okay.
know who some of the atheist Christians that you're referring to? Do you know who they would be? Or
Atheist Christians?
yeah, or I'm sorry, the atheist cosmologists who think that the universe definitely had a beginning.
Well, Stephen Hawking believed that the universe had a beginning, and he actually wrote that in his book.
Yeah, but Stephen Hawking was talking about the observable universe. He wasn't talking about all of reality, because all of reality could be multiple universes, right? And certainly there had to be some type of reality prior to when the universe began to expand. There was a cause of some sort. So,
I agree. Yeah,
right.
I agree.
But Stephen Hawking didn't agree that the cause was necessarily supernatural, or that it couldn't have been part of a multiverse.
Well, but whether what he thought the cause was is not really the point. The point is that he thought there was a beginning.
Right, but that's only to this presentation. That's not the beginning of all reality.
Well, but that depends on whether or not you want to provide evidence, and whether you want to say that there's a coherent theory that there's more to reality than just our current universe that we live in.
Isn't that what you're doing, though?
Not too long ago, I talked to a physicist by the name of Lawrence Krauss.
Yes, I'm familiar.
And we had a conversation a few weeks ago, and he came out with a book, and it's something like 2012, called A Universe from Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And he stated then that he said the universe didn't exist, and then it did exist. And so he is very very intentional, and he's very strong on the point that the universe had a beginning. He doesn't know that there is anything beyond our universe, that there are multiple universes, and
no one does.
And his kind of his outlook on this is that he believes in the principle of that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So right now,
in some cases, it is.
So right now, he doesn't think he says that there is no evidence that there are other universes besides ours, but he is looking for evidence for it. And he thinks that he may have stumbled on what the evidence might be, and it has something to do with low-grade gravitational fields or something like that. And so when I had this conversation with him, he said, "Stand by." And when I asked him for evidence of the multiverse, he said, "Stand by. We don't have it now. We're looking for it." And so there may be evidence and there may not be, depending on what we find when I pursue these lines of evidence.
So you don't believe in the multiverse because there's no evidence for it yet?
Well, I don't believe in it. I don't necessarily reject it, but right now, I don't affirm the existence of the multiverse or multiple universes because there's no evidence of their existence. But you
do affirm the existence of the supernatural.
Yes, but
is there evidence for the supernatural?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Sorry, I'll let you get at it. And this will be the last question. There's two other questions non-related to this because we talked about this for a while, and then I'll let you go. But go ahead.
All right. So, but real quickly, the idea of the multiverse is a semantic problem, and the reason that it's a semantic problem is that you could take all of reality and call it the universe, or you could take what we observe right now and say this is our universe, and there may be other universes. But all you could be saying is that the universe is made up of multiple compartments and multiple components, all of which we call universes. So when we talk about all of reality, that's what I prefer to talk about. That's what I mean by the universe.
Okay. I mean, I'm glad you stated that, and I'm glad you clarified, because it is a correct statement, the word universe, just like a lot of other words, has multiple usages. I would point out that in science and in cosmological science, universe has a very specific usage that is not the philosophical usage of universe, or rather the theological usage of universe, which is the one you're using for all of reality, right?
But it may not be philosophical or theological, but it is stipulative, nevertheless. So
when you say it, you're talking about the definition of all of reality is philosophical.
The definition of the word universe is stipulative in cosmology.
On what? Okay. I don't think that is correct, but what do you mean by that?
Well, there wasn't some revelation from Mount Olympus that came down and told us what the definition of the word universe is. So in science, the term universe has a stipulative definition. And if most scientists want to agree on that definition, then that's a working good definition, and it's useful and it's productive.
I think that in cosmology, there's a working definition that is agreed to in cosmology.
Yeah, and when you say is agreed to, what you're talking about is a stipulative definition
that they all use. Yeah, like they don't talk about the universe in the philosophical sense of all of reality.
But that's not a philosophical concept.
Well, it's not a scientific one, is my point. That's not the cosmological usage of it.
Well,
there are no scientific statements about all of reality.
Well, what you're saying is that scientists don't make statements about all of reality.
Right. So that's what I'm saying.
Science doesn't say anything. Only scientists say things. So
cosmologist is the science.
Cosmologist, right.
But in cosmology, the universe is defined as the matter, energy, space, and time, which began expanding at presumably the Big Bang.
Yeah, and that's a stipulative definition of the word universe.
Okay, right. So what I'm saying, but other definitions that are not that are not used in cosmology.
They may not be used in cosmology, but you can't justify the claim that they are no longer scientific simply because they're not normally used in cosmology.
Yes,
they could be used in cosmology 100 years from now, and suddenly everybody would consider it scientific.
Well, I can justify the statement that other usages are not scientific.
Okay, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think it's possible without being arbitrary. But let me just get to my what we're trying to get to here.
Sure.
And that is that natural forces, natural law, what we think of as natural law is not infinite, is not eternal.
Okay.
And so if it's not eternal, then it had to have come into existence at some point in the distant past. And if it came into existence at some point in the distant past, it had to have had a cause for it to come into existence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the cause of natural law cannot be natural law, because if it was, natural law would have had to existed before natural law existed, which is logically impossible. So it's necessarily impossible that natural law can account for the existence of natural law. There has to be something outside of natural law that brought natural law into existence. And that, whatever it is by definition outside of natural law, and therefore is by definition is supernatural. So the idea that natural law is its own cause and and is its own explanation and it is its own origin is logically absurd, because nothing can be its own origin, nothing could be its own cause. So nothing can account for its own existence. Something else has to account for the existence of natural law.
Does that apply to God?
Pardon me?
Does that apply to God?
No, because God's not a contingent being. God is not a caused being. God is an uncaused being.
So something can exist without being the cause of its own existence.
Only something that is uncontingent can exist without being the cause of its own existence.
Do we have an example of anything that's non-contingent existing?
God.
What? We have an example of God?
Well, we can't observe anything that is non-contingent, because by definition, if we observe it, it's contingent.
So we don't have an example of anything non-contingent.
No. Well, we don't have a scientific example. We don't have an example that we can go
We
locate
cannot
somewhere.
demonstrate. We cannot demonstrate anything non-contingent in reality.
No, we can't observe anything non-consistent, and we can't directly observe something that's non-contingent.
Okay, if we have no example,
But it's not the case that we can't demonstrate the existence of something that's non-contingent.
how would you
Those are
demonstrate
two
the
different
exist?
things.
How would you demonstrate the existence of a non-contingent thing?
Because in order for in order for all of contingent things to exist, there must be a non-contingent being that existed that got all of the rest of those things started.
That sounds like a tautology. That sounds like circular reasoning because that's the thing you're trying to prove. But how do you prove that without demonstrating the non-contingent thing?
Well, it's not I don't know if it's a tautology or not. Somebody has accused the contingency argument of being a tautology, but not all tautologies are necessarily false. So there are some tautologies that are necessarily true, and so we don't reject them simply because they're tautologies. So the argument from contingency for the existence of God is that we have a lot of contingent things in reference and beings in the universe, and they cannot have been their own cause because they're contingent. So for every contingent thing that you observe and that you can think of had to
Mhm.
have something behind it that caused its existence. And if something if whatever that caused the existence of a contingent thing was also contingent, then it had to have a cause behind it as well. So
Mhm.
all contingent beings in reference have causes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be contingent. But you cannot have an infinite regress of contingent causes. That's logically impossible. It's logically absurd. So there has to be an existing original non-contingent being that actually got contingent existence started in the first place, and that original being cannot itself be contingent because otherwise it would have to have a cause behind it, and it wouldn't be the original non-contingent cause of the rest of contingent causality.
I'm assuming you cover a lot of this or some of this in one of your books.
I do.
Which book is this argument covered in?
Machines don't laugh.
Machines Don't Laugh. Okay, you've written a number of books, and we have a couple of them up here. Mars Attacks is a very interesting title. I'm familiar with the film,
Marx
and
attacks.
Marx Attacks. Forgive me, and that is relating to your position or something you want to talk about, Marxism. I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the show.
Right.
And then you also have we talked about what is it? Machines. I'm blind. I can't. Machines Don't Laugh.
Machines
Okay.
don't laugh.
Gotcha. And a number of books here, different topics. It looks like deconstructing junk ideology. That seems like it might relate to theology.
There's some theology in it. Deconstructing junk ideology is mostly about the culture wars.
Ah, okay. The culture wars.
It's mostly about the conflict between the various ideologies that people hold in our culture, in our nation, and in the world in general.
And
So
then we have From Rome to Galilee. Now, if
yeah,
that's not religious, I don't know what is.
that that's a theological book.
There we go. So
Pure theology.
pure theology.
Exactly.
All
Yeah.
right. What do you have upcoming? Any future projects going on? You've already got a lot. By the way, your books, if anyone's interested, Phil's books are available for sale on Amazon.com. So, and you can, we also have links to all of his social media in the description as well. So, check those out. But what do you've got upcoming?
Well, I'm actually not going to be necessarily the guest, but in 2 days we're going to be having a discussion with Bart Ehrman.
Hmm,
Are you familiar with Bart Ehrman?
I am.
He was kind of the study
I've
buddy
I've
of Bruce
invited him
Metzger.
on my show,
Pardon me?
but I did it in a DM, which he may or may not have read
Oh, okay.
because he doesn't know who the heck I am. So, but yes, I would love to talk to Bart Ehrman. I don't know if he
Yeah.
wants to
So,
talk to me though,
well,
but go on.
you can talk to him in 2 days if you like, because you can
My
join our
new best
discussion.
friend.
You can join our discussion, absolutely.
Let's
So,
let's hook up after the show.
yeah, the
We will
one that
iron out these details.
yeah, the guy that put you and me together was a guy named James Walker, and he runs the Atheist and Christian Book Club,
Mhm.
which is a group of people who are atheists and Christians both. There's both worldviews are represented in the book club, and we're all friends and we all love each other. And there's some atheists and there's some Christians, and we discuss books every month on various topics related to atheism and theism and worldviews and so on. And on Thursday, we're going to be having Bart Ehrman as the guest on the Atheistic Christian Book Club, and anybody can participate. And I may want to give James a heads up, because I think this time he said space was limited, so I can give him a heads up and see if you can, if there's still an option for you to join up. But I think you would dearly love this book club, because our discussions are wonderful. That's where we had the discussion with Lawrence Krauss, and we've had discussions with. We had a discussion with John Loftus in January. He was our guest, and we discussed his book, The Case Against Miracles. So, yeah, that's something I'm definitely looking forward to coming up.
Well, I certainly appreciate the offer and the invite. And for anyone who's interested, we do have the link to the Atheist Christian Book Club in the comments. And so if you are participating in the chat and you are interested in that, check it out for yourself as well. So there it is right there.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. And I do usually, this is kind of the standard format when I have someone new on. I bring them on, I have them go through who they are, what they think, and then I kind of, push back a little bit just to make it kind of a more entertaining show. And you kind of stood up to the challenge, and I appreciate you being a good sport and not getting upset, because I'm all about fostering positive atheism and secular humanism and good conversations with people of different worldviews.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I enjoy this, just I enjoy this to no end. I can't tell you how enjoyable this is for me. And I think that Christians need to become skeptics. And many people are uncomfortable when I say that.
Yeah.
But I think that Christians do need to become skeptics. I think they need to be skeptical about what they believe, because it's Socrates said, if he really said this, I think he did, he said the unexamined life is not worth living, and unexamined Christianity is not worth practicing. And I can
tell you that I totally agree with that. I agree with that from the perspective of an atheist. My Christian self would have disagreed with you with that. And I suspect maybe one of the reasons you're making the statement is because so many Christians disagree with you. If I put on my Christian hat and listen to what you just said, I would say that skepticism is a weakness of faith, and doubt is the very thing that the Bible warns against. And if you want to strengthen your faith, you don't begin by being skeptical of God or his claims, because that leads to a different path. So that's probably what I would have said back when I was a Christian.
And I think a lot of Christians do say that. And I think doubt and skepticism is looked down upon in the Christian community all too often. And I think that's unfortunate. I really do. I think that Christians need to be willing and able to subject their faith and their beliefs to skeptical challenges. And I think if they don't, I think that they're missing something. And so, for example, I have two daughters, and they both, went to college. My oldest daughter has a PhD in Imperial Russian history. And when they came to me when they were in high school and said, "Dad, do you think I should go to a Christian college?" My answer was, "No, I don't think you should go to a Christian college. I absolutely don't think you should go to a Christian college. Because if you go to a Christian college, you're going to have all of your beliefs reinforced, and you're going to get into an echo chamber, and you're not going to be able to deal with any skeptical challenges to your faith once you graduate." And so I think that Christian young people should go to secular colleges, because their faith is going to get challenged in secular colleges, and they're going to learn, that there are a lot of people that don't buy some of the things that they're saying, and they need to learn how to defend those things.
Going right back to my geology professor, if there are any young Earth creationists in here, this class will contradict your beliefs. So that was just a warning she threw out there. This has been a great conversation, as evidenced from the comments that we are getting in the chat. So I appreciate everyone sticking by for that. I don't know if you have time to hang out in the Discord, or you have other plans, I kept you for an hour and 43 minutes. That is a little bit longer running than the show usually is. If you have some time after that, you are welcome to stop in the Discord. If you have other places to be, we understand that too. And for anyone else who watched, I will join you in the Discord. But
I don't have any plans, you know, so I don't have any restrictions on my time this evening. When you say the Discord, are you talking about, like another conversation that's not being broadcast?
Yes, this Discord is basically a fun place where friends and family of the show who watch the show can interact with whoever we have on as a guest,
Okay.
or just talk to each other about the content of the show or other stuff. So it's kind of like a little after party we do, and it's not recorded. It doesn't go on the show. But
I love after parties. I went to an after party from a Mannheim Steamroller concert a few years ago and got to meet the band, and it was an absolute blast, you know. So I would love to be part of the after party if I'm invited.
Well, you hang out backstage as we go to the break. Everyone else, if you are interested in participating, we will have a link for you in the comments rather. And yeah, we appreciate Phil Bair for coming on the show. You are, of course, invited back as well. I would like to get you on because we had a lot to talk about, and unfortunately, it's just skimming the surface when it's just your first visit. You know, it's impossible to hash out kind of all of these things in one
Definitely.
visit. But you are definitely invited back, and we enjoyed having you. If you guys enjoyed
being on.
Oh, absolutely. If you guys enjoyed this show, do me a favor, hit the like button. And if you're not already subscribed, which is really inexcusable, I mean, you guys know me by now, you need to subscribe to Tang. The Bryce is right. I'm right on this one. Just subscribe. If you're not subscribed, it doesn't make any sense.
I second that.
Yeah. And especially if you're looking for more awesome secular content. For Oz, producer Wes, Sunny Shell, and am I missing anybody? No, that's it. Just me. I'm Brycearonee. Have a good morning, have a good evening, and a good afternoon. Wow, I screwed up my own tagline. Have a good morning, have a good afternoon, and a good evening. Forget it. I'll see you guys next time on The Bryce is Right.